Yeah, great. Thanks a lot for hosting, Bram, and great to be in this call again. I'm always super inspired by all the pictures that are being shared, and it just shows the richness and the diversity of this. Yeah, about myself, I think this is the third time contributing to this webinar. I work for Foresight for Food and the University of Oxford, and in the past, I've also presented things from my previous work, which I was doing for ICO, which is now part of Cordate, when I was working in Myanmar. And for this session, I'll be presenting a new topic, which is some of the work we've been doing around Lake Turkana and using foresight and food systems analysis to shape investment in that domain. So I'll be sharing you that practical hands-on case about how we can use foresight and food systems analysis on the ground in practice. Really great to see a lot of the interaction already happening in the chat, by the way. I think there's a lot of questions coming out and very good questions as well. So I'll also try to keep my presentation short enough so that we can have a nice engagement as well. So let me share my screen, and then I would like to then kick off with the presentation on foresight for food systems transformation. In a way, it's very much complementary to what Just has been presenting, and I think in a way we have worked together also for a couple of years. So I think our presentations also naturally build on each other. Just to briefly add again, my name is Bram. I work with Foresight for Food, but also based out of University of Oxford Environmental Change Institute. And this is actually a new presentation about some of the work we've been doing in the past 3 years, also with Wageningen and many colleagues in different countries, Kenya, Uganda, Jordan, Bangladesh. But before I want to sort of kick off with the content, I want to also just, since everyone's so active in writing and thinking, I want to ask you a question. What do these people have in common? The first is a butcher in China. The second is a Brazilian soy farmer. The third is a Yemeni pirate. And the fourth is a Panama customs officer. And maybe just to already invite you in the chat to sort of think about, hey, what could be the main thing that these different stakeholders have in common? And don't overthink it. Just write something in the chat that comes to mind. And it's not food systems, right? I mean, that's too general, and you're all sort of course, expecting the food system to somehow come in. But I'm also curious to hear from you, like, yeah, what people are thinking, right? Okay, Ashuman's writing, they all eat. They want to make a living. Yeah, okay, of course. Yeah, very good. Consumers, food chain actors. Okay, there's a lot coming in already. Survival, consumers, partnership is coming in. All right, can we be a bit more specific? Food production, logistics, that's sort of coming a little bit more in the direction. Can we get it a little bit warmer? What about logistics? What about, the global food system? That's obviously, okay, soy trade's coming more. Transport, okay, now we're getting pretty warm. Food value chain distributions. Okay, this is great. I mean, there's a lot of really nice interactions coming in. Yes, I mean, of course, these are all food systems actors. Yeah, network supply chains. All right, yeah, all right. So this is great, and this is getting people thinking, right? Because we're talking about food systems, and it's also important to realize that there's no one food system. There's a whole food system that sort of operates globally, regionally, across continents, and also locally. And in this situation, the answer to this is coming from a report that was developed by Chatham House in 2017 about choke points and vulnerabilities in global food trade. And this is basically talking about the fact that our value chains and supply chains are so interconnected across the world that our food and food consumption is reliant on stuff that's being produced across the world, right? So soy needs to go to China in order to feed pigs that are then slaughtered, and they're passing through the Red Sea Strait and the Panama Customs Canal. And especially very recently, as you probably will have noticed, the whole sort of situation around the war between US and Iran is centering around a very small area, which is the Strait of Hormuz, where 30% of global energy fossil fuels are being transported through, which potentially could translate into fertilizer price increases and thereby food price increases, right? So this is huge, and this is just showing the level of connectivity that exists across the world when it comes to food systems, and also shows you that we can talk about local food systems, but in the end, it's connected to a lot of different things happening at global level. So thanks for that interaction, and let's get into it. I will briefly show a bit what we are doing at Foresight for Food. I will talk about food systems. I will not address that in depth because you've had a session on that previously, and you can also read the slides later and also get some of the links that I've also embedded there as well if you're interested. And then I will sort of indicate a little bit how we as Foresight for Food are trying to shape a participatory multi-stakeholder process using food systems thinking, foresight, as just also explained, on the ground. And I'll use that by sort of sharing an example that we've had around Lake Turkana in Kenya, where we're trying to see how we can, from a fisheries perspective, engage in a systemic way. And I'll conclude with some insights. So Foresight for Food is a network composed of many different international agencies, research institutes, funders, food systems, providers and users of foresight. And then foresight is really about sort of using futures thinking, scenario analysis linked to food systems understanding, food systems action to support food systems transformation. And we build capacities, we link across different spaces, participatory processes, quantitative modeling and simulation. And we're also especially interested and linking different country level experiences and lessons. A lot of this work has also been coming out of a program that was supported by the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs and was supported by IFAD, the International Fund for Agriculture Development. And that was a 3-year program in 4 different countries with Oxford, Wageningen, and many in-country research partners. So now the reason why we're talking about this, right? And this is no surprise to you all, I would guess, is that we're seeing a lot of big challenges around food systems in the world right now. So, and they're sort of coming in different domains, right? So food security, health situations. We've got a lot of challenges related to livelihood, smallholder farmers, informal traders, consumers, a lot of inequality in the food system as well, where they've got a couple of very big companies who are dominating the market globally versus a lot of people who are struggling, and then increasingly urgently a climate change emergency and a planetary boundaries environmental issue that's also coming in. And food systems play a role in all those different domains, both in terms of receiving the consequences of these, as well as causing a lot of the problems that we now see. This relates to a couple of different things. Food security. I mean, there's millions of people facing hunger, according to the yearly SOFI reports. There's billions of people who are moderately or severely food insecure. Healthy diets are even more inaccessible to many people. There's an increasing healthcare issue, especially in high-income countries, but also increasingly in lower middle-income countries. And it's really bizarre if you think about adult obesity being on the rise, right? So this first result is from 2.1% in 2012 to 15.8% in 2022, which is massive. And think about the healthcare consequences that are also entailing in that, in terms of also the cost to society, as well as the loss of labor productivity. And this is expected to continue the coming decades as well. We see that livelihood issues are affected. So 50% of the global population is reliant on food systems and livelihoods in some way. And these are often the people who are paid less, and often the poorest of the people in societies who are being affected by this as well. Climate and environment. So I mentioned already, food systems are the cause, as well as in a way often very much affected by climate and environmental issues. And I think in the past, it has not been understood fully how deeply that connectivity is, right? So emissions by agriculture are causing a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. A lot of soil degradation is also due to agricultural practices. Biodiversity losses of 60% is huge, and that is also a huge thing that's not talked about enough. when we talk about deforestation, etc. So a lot of things are connected. I've just added this one recently, talking about interdependence. I've mentioned already Strait of Hormuz, but if you see this graph, so we can expect the link between food and fertilizer and energy to be still relevant. And especially if we think about processes like the Haber-Bosch fertilizer process, in which we, millions and billions of people depend upon for food security. It's still very much a fossil fuel driven food system. So there's also questions about our choices, right? So what should we eat and what are we producing? The healthy eating plate model suggests that we should be eating 50% fruits and vegetables. But what are we actually producing is very different. I mean, we're sort of still a very cereal-oriented agricultural system. Where a majority is food and starches. And if you look at that sugar percentage, right, it doesn't even exist in the healthy eating plate, but it's 16% of what we're producing, which is massive. And it has, once again, then sort of implications for what we eat and what we put on our plates. So there's a big discrepancy there, a big dilemma also in terms of, how do you actually eat and how do you actually change behaviors according to this huge difference. The cost of food is increasingly being recognized, right? So the food system globally delivers, yearly GDP of 14 trillion, but the expected costs are actually 13 trillion, right? So it makes a lot of financial sense to transform the food system. So the question is then also, why can't we make that sort of clear enough so that it actually happens, right? And I think that's one of those things that are also an invitation to many of you to think about. Why is it that we can't see the cost of what the trade-offs and the effects are of the way we're producing food? So I'll also mention that we're facing turbulence and growing uncertainty, right? We've come from a situation where, there was, of course, a lot of challenges, and yet we saw progress. But now we see in the last 2-3 years that things are becoming increasingly uncertain and dangerous. Well, there's, of course, Trump as a big agent of chaos currently on the global stage. You've got the climate crisis, which is now accelerating, where people are getting worried that tipping points are being reached. And then finally now in the last week, the new war in the Middle East, which, comes on top of a lot of other, big challenges, especially also Ukraine, Russia war also still ongoing. So, this is also another, urgency that sort of adds on top of everything. So, concluding this little section, it's really about saying, well, food systems are actually at the center of a lot of the big problems that we have. And we could also flip it around. So we see all these challenges, but what are the opportunities then that we can see how food systems could, be changed? And how can we also generate synergies or benefits that will also spin off and reinforce other changes in other domains as well? So we need a systems-wide approach. And that's basically what Just also showed, is that we can connect across different areas, that we can think holistically, that we can think about multidisciplinarity, linking different expertise to sort of solve collective issues that we see at food system level. So food systems are complex and adaptive. This picture is incomprehensible generally, so I won't bother to explain it. It's basically the same thing as what Just was saying. There's so many different things connecting. But what's critical here is that, there's so many different things here that we need to keep in mind, right? So systems are self-organizing. They are emerging. We cannot engineer them. We can only sort of, deal with them and dance with them, as Donella Meadows would say. It's unpredictable. It's dynamic. We see tipping points. And basically, things are connected in unexpected ways, right? So this is why we need to learn about systems and what we need to become aware of. And we need to become systems literate in understanding how we deal with these problems. So cutting it into the 3 different parts, Just already showed about all of these things. We need to talk about outcomes. We need to talk about activities. We need to talk about drivers. And we can do that in different ways. So that's basically also saying, well, these things are connected and we want to be able to sort of navigate that dynamism and also to connect things that maybe we wouldn't naturally connect. I'll sort of move through this part a little bit quickly, but you can read this later. But essentially, we want to understand different parts of the system, what incentives or signals could, help to change things, what drivers and feedback loops are important. And especially, what do we want from food systems? And that's, I think, one of the crucial things that taps into what Just was talking about in terms of mental models. So we use foresight and futures thinking a lot to also help people to make the next step in sort of saying, okay, interesting, you've got a food system, but now what? And in the light of all this turbulence, uncertainty, ambiguity, there's a whole range of different risks and opportunities that we want to be sort of addressing and also grabbing. And we use foresight to navigate uncertainty and turbulent times. We want to also know what the implications are of the current situation, current trends, and future uncertainties for our businesses, for our value chains, for our different local food systems, etc. And we want to also envisage more desirable alternative futures. I think one of the challenges that we're facing is that, you know, we want a better food system, but how does it actually look? And how can we get a conversation going around what is a food system that we can sort of work together to, you know, improve? And how should that then sort of work? And then finally, it's all about sort of nudging systems. Can we sort of push systems in a new direction collectively? We use a framework. I'll just go through this very quickly: scope the process, map the food system, explore future scenarios, mobilize for systems change. And I think the crucial step is the fourth one. It's about, you're not doing research, you're really doing a change process in a way. And you want to do that iteratively, you want to learn and adapt, and you want to also harness the evidence base that you have together with the stakeholder participation that you can mobilize. And these ingredients are a way of applying food systems analysis and foresight in practice. And we have a whole range of different participatory tools that we also map in we've got also a guide on our website that you can have a look at as well. And I'll see if I can send that along with you. So let me go into the example. So we did this process together with a new program that was supported by the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands in Kenya, and it's implemented by World Food Programme and UNESCO. And it's about the unlocking of economic potential in Lake Turkana. And there's a lot of, you know, complex problems. Just already talked about the difference between complicated and complex. I mean, this is definitely a complex setting, and there's, you know, remote desert saline lake, there's climate effects, there's high incidences of food and nutrition security, cross-border dynamics, conflict, a huge gap in data on also how the lake itself actually works, tectonic dynamics, etc., and the whole history of white elephants, right? So there's been a lot of interventions taking place which have not generated the impact that we're hoping for. So these are all sort of the context in which we try to set up this inception phase for this new economic development program, while sort of taking on board that sort of holistic systems perspective. And what we did is we set up a whole participatory process with workshops on both sides of the lake, Marsabit, Turkana sides, engaging communities around the borders of the Turkana Lake, also together with government agencies, businesses, local representatives and leaders, pastoralists as well, and to sort of map the system together, right? And to come together and sort of get a common understanding of what is the situation around the lake and all the dynamics historically that have also been important. And we did that through rich picturing. So we had people coming together to draw and visualize the system and show its complexity to each other from different perspectives. And this was hugely powerful because it showed how everyone around the table had a form of knowledge or experience or contribution to add to the knowledge base. It also built connections. People got sort of better understanding of each other's perspectives. People learned new things that they also didn't know. And it helped us a lot to get an idea of all the different stakeholders that are, you know, operating around the lake. We did a trend analysis. So we tried to also use evidence that we could find, data walks, historical knowledge, local knowledge, and understanding the trends to sort of see where the uncertainties were lying. And we used sort of a very basic, very accessible tool that was, you know, very much something that everyone could contribute to. And basically also helped us to understand, you know, where people were coming from, what was happening in the past, what people saw happening currently, as well as what they expected would happen in the future. We developed scenarios. So we built 6 different scenarios about different futures based on combinations of uncertainties. And these led to very rich discussions and exchange of ideas, where we had a sort of a paradise scenario where, all the different investments played out well and sustainability was included. But we also had, very ambivalent and difficult scenarios: ticking time bomb, short gain, long pain scenario. We had a scenario 5, in which the whole fisheries sector wasn't delivering the benefits that were expected, but people adjusted and invested in other domains. But we also had a very negative scenario that was actually, for many stakeholders, a very likely scenario, which was in a way also quite worrying and also quite humbling for the members of the project team also. We did causal loop diagramming, so we got people to sit around the table and sort of understand what was connected to what were the feedbacks and systems dynamics that were taking place around this whole area, and basically get people into a discussion about, so what if this thing changes, what then is the consequence on something else? And it helped people to understand that things were connected in the system, right? So if one thing happened on one side of the area in terms of environment, then it would in the end have an impact on economic activity or social dynamics, for instance. And this gave us a lot of really interesting insights. So we had some observations around this idea that, what is fishery really like around Lake Turkana, right? We saw that it's cyclical. And it basically depends on the level of success of pastoralist livelihoods, because generally people don't want to be fishermen. They want to be pastoralists, right? So, any success in fishery is probably temporary, because people will use the money to buy cattle or livestock and go back into pastoralism, which is really interesting from an investment perspective to know about. People don't really like to eat fish, which is also interesting, right? So okay, interesting. What does this mean then for local market development? Does it even make sense to promote, fish around the lake? We saw that competition between groups risks destroying investments, right? So if one group gets something from a particular ethnic group, then the other will get jealous and try to destroy it, right? So you have to be very careful about where you sort of make those tangible investments, for instance. And then finally, what are the opportunities as well as the risks, right? So there's very limited fresh water, but there's wind and sun, right? So maybe there's something there that you can build on to generate some sort of momentum. And this, just generally shows that there's a lot of stuff that you can do. This is just an example of some of the, digitalization we did of these causal loop diagrams. And it just shows the enormous complexity of the thing. But it also shows, one of the ways in which you can map this system, and where you can sort of thinking about, hey, where can we sort of try to work on paradigm shifts, work on, the slow engines of change perhaps happen, the growth engines, and what are some of the things that we see might be happening on the longer term if we are successful with our work, and what are the spin-offs we could look for. So yeah, basically we did a lot on articulating visions and transformations needed, bringing these different things together to come up with directions of systems change. And that in the end, led us to make a sort of what we call a subsystem analysis. So basically seeing all these different domains being connected to each other. And that helped us to come up with leverage points, essentially what Just was explaining, right? So we want to sort of see how all these different things are sort of generating a positive or virtuous cycle that could hopefully be resilient over time. And I won't go into this in detail, but you can have a look later. And then in the end, we built a systemic theory of change, which is composed of pathways, processes, partnerships that are needed essentially supported by this sort of systems perspective, systems principles, and this idea of adaptive project management, which we really important also to share with the World Food Programme and the UNESCO teams, that they need to think differently about how to manage this, right? So they need to build relationships rather than sort of spend a lot of time on interventions. They need to do phasing. They need to work on mindset changes, both with the stakeholders as well as with their team. They need to, be open to experimentation and learning, agility, entrepreneurship, and especially also localized decision-making. So not coming in and saying, hey, this is what we need to do. And this led to, in the end, a very big systemic view of investing in the future of Lake Turkana, which is basically sort of taking on board all these different analysis steps, but also coming up with particular pillars of sort of categories of areas where you want to be working, and you want to be also thinking about certain scenario warnings or opportunities and risks that might emerge over time. So this is the last section. I hope I'm still more or less in time. Bram, just give me a sign. But there's a couple of concluding insights that we can make from this work, and I hope to build on also your understanding of this. But essentially, we see that we need to work with complex adaptive systems. We also need to realize then that no single intervention will work, and this is also then building on the slide of just about conditions for systems change. We're working on different levels, and we don't have magic bullet solutions. What we also need to be doing is to think differently also about development practice, right? Sustainable development means that we need to be testing ideas, we need to be adaptive and learn about what works and what doesn't. And we need to probably do that again and again in different contexts and build on the local knowledge that's there, rather than coming in and saying, hey, this worked somewhere else and it therefore shall potentially work here as well. Change in food systems is also always going to be multi-stakeholder, and especially it's going to need to be also very much focused on working with power and sort of working with power dynamics, also changing power relations and changing mindsets. And they will need to be confronted. So we will need to problematize certain things that we think are normal. And then finally, we need sort of new alliances, unexpected sort of combinations and partners, new narratives, and new visions for the future. And perhaps patience as well, at least an awareness of time. And then I've put between brackets, if a crisis doesn't strike first, I think maybe a crisis is probably the best way to realize transformative change in a short time. And yeah, maybe that time is now, if the Iran situation continues. But anyway, coming back also interestingly to the same thing that Jess was sharing, what we need to keep an eye on perspective, and we need more synthesis rather than only analysis. And this is one of the things that I think is really important. Maybe a bit of an anticipation of some of your questions. This should not only be a research academic type of exercise. This should be a participatory, action-driven perspective, right? And that's why we shouldn't get stuck into analysis paralysis. Increasingly of importance is food system resilience, the shocks to come. There's work being done already by colleagues in Wageningen on how to build resilience. I've put here also anti-fragility. So that's a concept which I think is also really interesting and important. How do we become stronger after recurring crises? And then I'll sort of close with, one of the most powerful and confronting questions that you could sort of ask yourself and others around you. This comes from this book from Peter David Stroh. It's a recommended read. It's basically asking the question of, why have we not been able to achieve this goal despite our best efforts, right? So, and this is coming back to a lot of things. Like, we've been practicing development cooperation for decades. We've been working in particular sectors for many years, and yet, we're still facing a lot of challenges, right? So, and maybe that also partly has to do with the way our own organizations work, right? So it's really also provocatively asking, can we reevaluate our own contribution to this whole thing, despite the fact that we are, of course, doing our best. So I'll keep it there for now, and looking forward to the discussion.